Before we start demonstrating actual layers, let's take a little tour of the layers panel. First thing is to make sure you have a layers panel. If it doesn't exist, one of the things you can do is you can go up here to the upper right, and this drop down shows various configurations for the workspace, and I have photography checked, and that will bring up certain tabs, and that should bring up the layers panel here. You can also look up here on the Windows menu and make sure that layers is checked here, because if I uncheck it, you see that goes away, and check it and it comes back. The next thing I would do is adjust the size of these thumbnails here. This is a list of the layers on this particular image. I have 7 layers here, and as you can see, these thumbnails are pretty small and it's hard to tell what's going on. If you go into the upper right hand corner of the layers, there's a little flyout menu that has a lot of actions that you can take on a layer. Down here you will see panel options. Go ahead and check that, and you can see thumbnail size. What I would do, I would check the largest and click OK. Now you can tell better what's going on here on your layers panel. One of the things to note on the layers panel is this highlighting. This indicates which is the active layer. And that's going to become important as you're editing, and sometimes things are not going right and you're wondering what's going on. Most of the time you're probably on the wrong layer. So take note which is the active layer, because whatever you're doing on your image is going to be reflected in that layer. Next to each layer you can see this little eyeball, and what that has to do is with the visibility of the layer. So you can turn a layer on or off so you can see the effect. Let's turn a couple of these off. Those two are probably hard to tell on the screen, but this layer is my vignette layer. You can see when I turn it off that it gets rid of the vignette. So this is particularly helpful when you're trying to judge an adjustment or an effect that you put on the photograph, and what was my results. Let's say, for example, well, I think the vignette is still too dark around the edges. One possibility is I can change the opacity of a layer, how transparent it is. Now notice the opacity is grayed out, and this is because I don't have this layer highlighted. There, okay, I highlight the layer. Remember what I said earlier, the effect is on the layer that is active, so this is now my active layer. And if I go up to the opacity, and I can change this one of 3 ways. I could enter a number in here if I knew it. I could use this drop down bar that would change the percentage of the effect. Or if I go to the word opacity, you'll see this double-headed arrow come out, which is called like a scrub control. So I can just move it back and forth, getting the effect that I wanted. So let's say that looks good. I still have my vignette, but it's not as strong around the edges. Also note here the fill. Let me take this back up to 100%. And it's kind of confusing what fill does. If you see fill, it is going to act the same way as opacity in most circumstances, but there are some circumstances where fill does give you a different action, and we're going to talk about that in a later lesson. Okay, let's turn the visibility of these layers back on. One good working habit to get into is to label your layers something meaningful. Now when you bring in a photograph, Photoshop is going to automatically label the base layer background. And after that, each layer created is going to say layer 1, 2, or 3. Now there are some plugins, like here I used a Nik plugin and it said Viveza 2, which is one of the plugin features, and it just automatically labeled it for me. But most are not labeled. So what you want to do to label this one here, which just says layer 1, is a high pass sharpening label. So what I usually do is double click on that and then key in, and I'll say high pass sharp. And this lets me know when I come back weeks later or months later what it was that I was accomplishing with each of these layers. So make that part of your workflow. Label them all, and you don't want to come back and see a bunch of backgrounds, layer 1, 2, 3, and 4. Above the list of layers, we see this drop-down menu. This is our blend modes for the layers. We're going to be going over that in another dedicated lesson, so just know that it's there right now. Go to the extreme bottom right and you'll see a row of icons that do various things to the layer panel. The one here in the bottom right is a trash can. So you can delete the active layer. I just hit that. It'll ask me if I want to delete it. Or I can just drag the active layer to that trash can and it'll delete it. So let me do a Control Z and reverse that out. And then the next one looks like a blank piece of paper, is for adding new layers, new blank layers. Notice the checkerboard pattern in it. That indicates a clear layer, a transparent layer. So you know that there's nothing on that layer right now. Let's reverse that out with a Control Z. Just a little shortcut. You notice that it added it above the active layer. If I hold down Control and hit it, it will add it below the active layer. The next one that looks like a little folder is groups. This is where you can take various layers and put them inside a folder. That grouping to help manage the number of layers that you have here. Well, let's take these two layers for example. They have to do with contrast in my photo. So let me select this one and make it active. And then holding down Control on PC or Command on Mac, let me have both of these selected. And let's say I want to put them in a group. I hit the little folder icon and it just says group 1. If I hit the arrow here, you can see that it placed those two layers inside that group. And just like we talked about for layers, we do need to label it. So let's double click here and highlight it. And then we'll put in contrast. Okay, so now we have both of those layers under the contrast folder. The next icon that looks like a half filled in circle is a special kind of layer. They're called adjustment layers. If we click on that, we will see a list of adjustments that can be made, and it'll automatically create a layer and a mask for us. Let's say we wanted to make the photo black and white. Well, we've got the adjustment layer, but the photo's still not black and white. This is an example of understanding your layering order. Because we have these two colored layers above it, that's what's showing right now. So if we just move this up to right above, now it is a black and white layer. You'll also see this white mask next to it, which it automatically created. We're not going to be talking about masking in this part. That'll be part 2. So we'll talk more about that. But I wanted to let you know that the adjustment layers were there. In fact, the next icon after the adjustment layers is to add masks. And we won't be covering this in part 1, but we will be covering it in part 2. Okay, this takes care of the mechanics of dealing with the layers panel. So the next thing we're going to look into is how we can apply this in our photographs.